The last drops of coffee sizzled on the hot plate, the smell of burnt sugar and stale regret hanging thick in the air. Rain hammered against the diner's plate glass windows, turning the neon sign into a blurry pink watercolor of the word, eat. Zara dragged a damp cloth across the vinyl countertop, her movements automatic, her mind miles away. It was almost 2 in the morning. Just her, the cook humming off-key in the back, and the storm. Her feet ached in her worn-out sneakers, a deep, resonant throb that had become the soundtrack to her life. The light orange of her uniform dress felt flimsy against the night's chill, a stark contrast to the starchy, white apron tied tight around her waist. The bell above the door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound at odds with the men who entered. There were 3 of them, moving with a synchronized silence that sucked the air out of the room. They brought the cold and the wet with them, their expensive shoes, leaving dark prints on the checkered linoleum. 2 were built like brick walls in black suits, their eyes scanning the empty diner with a predatory stillness. But it was the man in the middle who held the room's gravity. He wore a charcoal suit that was so perfectly tailored it seemed less like fabric and more like a second skin, molded to the lean, hard lines of his body. It was Tom Ford. She recognized the cut from a magazine she'd flipped through once on her break. He didn't look at her, not at first. His attention was on the way the rain distorted the city lights, his profile sharp and unforgiving. His dark hair was slicked back from his forehead, and as he finally turned, his eyes found hers. They were dark, so dark they seemed to absorb the diner's weak light, and they held an unnerving, absolute calm. He moved like the world owed him space, and the world, it seemed, agreed. Zara straightened her spine, her professionalism a thin shield against the sudden tension. "Table or booth?" she asked, her voice steady. The man in the center gestured to a booth in the corner, the one with the torn vinyl seat she usually steered customers away from. He slid in, his men taking the opposite side, facing the door. They were his guards, his soldiers. Her mind, usually occupied with tuition fees and late rent, suddenly felt very small and very naive. She grabbed 3 menus, her hands feeling clumsy. She set them on the table, along with glasses of water. The central man never took his eyes off her. It wasn't a leer, nothing so crude. It was an assessment, a quiet and total inventory of her existence. She felt stripped bare under that gaze, from the fraying hem of her dress to the exhaustion she knew was plain on her face. "Coffee," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and quiet, yet it carried the weight of command. "No, please. No, thank you. Just the order." "And for you?" she asked, turning to the other 2. They just stared at her, their expressions blank. The boss made a small, almost imperceptible motion with his hand, and they remained silent. "Just 3 coffees," he clarified, his gaze unwavering. Zara nodded and retreated to the counter, her back prickling with the feeling of being watched. She poured the coffee, her hands shaking just slightly. She told herself it was the caffeine, the late hour. It was a lie. This was different. This was danger, polished and bespoke, sitting in her corner booth. She brought the mugs over. As she leaned in to place his cup on the table, one of the men on the other side made a guttural sound, clutching his stomach and lurching forward. "Water," he gasped, knocking his own glass to the floor. It shattered, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet diner. "I'll get it," Zara said instantly, her training kicking in. She knelt to pick up the larger shards of glass, her focus entirely on the mess. It was a simple, effective distraction. For a single, fluid second, her back was to the man in the charcoal suit. In that second, he moved. His hand was a pale blur, a surgeon's motion, quick and precise. It dipped into the large pocket of her apron where she kept her tips, her keys, and her worn leather wallet. He lifted it without a sound, without disturbing the fabric. It was an act of impossible grace, a theft so clean it might as well have been magic. He settled back against the vinyl, the wallet concealed in his palm, his expression unchanged. By the time she had swept up the glass and brought a fresh water, the moment was gone. The man who had feigned sickness was sitting up straight again, his face a stony mask. She refilled his glass, her senses on high alert, but she couldn't pinpoint why. They drank their coffee in silence. The minutes stretched, each one thick with unspoken tension. Finally, the man in the center placed $100 bill on the table. It was crisp, new. Far too much for 3 coffees. He slid out of the booth, his men rising with him. He paused for a moment beside the table, his dark eyes meeting hers one last time. There was something in them now, a flicker of what? It was gone before she could name it. Then they were gone, the bell chiming their exit, leaving only the scent of rain, expensive cologne, and a silence that felt heavier than before. Zara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She cleared the table, her hands moving quickly, eager to erase their presence. She pocketed the $100 bill, a small thrill of relief cutting through her unease. It would cover her bus pass for the month, with plenty left over. An hour later, her shift was over. She untied her apron, hung it on its hook, and grabbed her worn coat. Yawning, she reached into her coat pocket for her wallet to get her bus fare. It wasn't there. A knot of cold dread formed in her stomach. She checked her other pocket. Nothing. Frantically, she remembered. Her apron. She had put her wallet in her apron pocket at the start of her shift because the pocket in her dress had a hole. She ran back to the hook, her heart starting to pound. She plunged her hand into the apron's deep pocket. It was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Everything was in that wallet. Her ID. The $74 she'd scraped together for the electric bill. And the photo. The one thing she owned that was irreplaceable. She sank onto a stool, her head in her hands. It had to have been them. The distraction, the weird silence, the intense way he had watched her. It was a setup. But why? Why would men like that, in suits that cost more than her rent, steal a waitress's cheap wallet? Her mind raced. She couldn't call the police. What would she say? Some rich guys in suits stole her wallet? They'd laugh at her. She was stranded, moneyless, and utterly alone. That was when she saw it. A long, black sedan, impossibly sleek, had pulled up to the curb outside the diner. It was the kind of car that belonged in movies, not outside a greasy spoon at 3 in the morning. It sat there, engine humming, its tinted windows like black mirrors reflecting the rain-streaked street. The back door opened. One of the henchmen from earlier stepped out, holding a small black umbrella. He didn't approach the diner door. He just stood by the open car door, waiting. He met her gaze through the window, and then he held something up. Her wallet. Relief warred with a new, more profound fear. He gestured with his head toward the car. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had no choice. She could stay here, penniless and helpless, or she could walk out into the rain and get into that car, into the heart of the danger that had so deliberately sought her out. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and pushed it open. The cold, damp air hit her face. She walked across the wet pavement, the man holding the umbrella steady over her head. She didn't look at him. She looked into the dark interior of the car, where a shadow waited. This was the moment everything changed. She was a girl who worked at a diner. Now she was something else. She was his problem to solve. She got in, and the door closed behind her with a soft, heavy thud that sealed her in. The silence inside the car was absolute. It was a rich person's silence, insulated from the outside world by layers of leather and soundproofing. The rain was a distant, rhythmic tapping on the roof, a world away. Zara sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her cheap coat feeling rough and out of place against the plush seat. The henchman who had escorted her was in the passenger seat, the other driving. In the seat beside her, separated by a foot of empty space that felt like a canyon, was him. Quan Jinhuan. He didn't look at her. He stared out the window at the blurred city lights, but she felt his awareness of her in the air, a physical pressure. Her wallet sat on the console between them. It looked small and pathetic in the opulent car. They drove for what felt like an eternity, leaving the gritty downtown streets behind and ascending into the hills where the houses became mansions and the roads were slick and empty. The car finally glided through an iron gate and into a subterranean parking garage, coming to a stop in a private, numbered slot. "Come," Jean said. It was the first word he'd spoken. She followed him into a private elevator that whisked them upwards, the ride so smooth she barely felt the motion. The doors opened directly into a penthouse. The view hit her first. An entire wall was glass, a panoramic vista of Los Angeles glittering below, a carpet of diamonds strewn across black velvet. The apartment was a study in minimalist luxury, dark wood floors, white walls, furniture that was more art than function. It was cold, beautiful, and utterly soulless. Jean walked to the center of the room, shrugging off his suit jacket and draping it over the back of a severe-looking sofa. He gestured to a low glass table.
"Seat."
Zara hesitated, then perched on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than her entire life's earnings. He stood before her, a predator in his own domain. He picked up her wallet from where his man had placed it on the table. He didn't open it. He simply held it. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you take this?" He ignored the question. His dark eyes were fixed on her, analytical and intense. "There was a photograph inside," he stated, not asked. "A small one, faded, tucked behind the driver's license." Her breath caught in her throat. The photo, the one of her and Jawa. "It's mine," she said, a protective instinct flaring. "It's the only one I have." He finally moved, walking over to a sleek black cabinet. He opened a drawer and took something out, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. He walked back and placed it on the glass table between them. It was the photo, a tiny, dog-eared square of paper. A 7-year-old girl with bright eyes and 2 missing front teeth, her arm thrown around the shoulders of a slightly older boy. The boy was skinny, with a defiant haircut and a smudge of dirt on his cheek, but his eyes, even in the faded image, were fiercely protective of the girl beside him. "Where did you get this?" Jean asked, his voice low, a strange vibration running through it. "St. Jude's Home for Children," she answered automatically. "It was taken the week before he was adopted. His name was Jawa. He was my best friend." The silence that followed was so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. Jean stared down at the photo, his jaw tight. When he looked up, the mask was gone. For a fleeting second, she saw not the terrifying man in the suit, but the lonely, fierce boy from the picture. The look in his eyes was one of raw, unguarded pain. "They told me you were placed with a family a month after I left," he said, his voice rough. "They said you were happy, safe." Zara's mind struggled to connect the dots. The boy in the photo, the man in front of her, the name. It was impossible. "Jawa," she whispered, the name feeling foreign and sacred on her tongue after 15 years. He gave a sharp, humorless nod. "My name is Quan Jinhuan now." He looked away from her, toward the window, toward the sprawling city he had clearly conquered. "The family that adopted me, they weren't what they seemed. They were part of this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent room, at the life it represented. "They didn't want a son. They wanted an heir, one they could mold, one they could break and rebuild in their own image." His wound was suddenly laid bare. The vulnerability he kept hidden under layers of Tom Ford suits and lethal stillness. It wasn't just a lost childhood. It was a betrayal that had forged him into this man. He had been taken from the one person who represented home, and he could never go back for her. He had failed to protect her. As the weight of his confession settled between them, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The wounded boy vanished, and the cold, tactical leader returned. He answered, speaking in rapid, low Korean. Zara didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was lethal. He ended the call and looked at her, his eyes hard again. "There's a problem. A rival family, the choice. They believe they've found a vulnerability. They're watching me." His gaze was pointed, leaving no doubt as to what, or who, that vulnerability was. You can't leave. Now that you've been seen with me. Now that you're in here, leaving is a death sentence. They will assume you know something. They will take you to get to me. The danger she had only sensed before was now explicit, a tangible threat that filled the room. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of this glass cage. He turned his back to her, walking toward a panel in the wall. I have to make a call. Stay here. He disappeared into another room, leaving the door slightly ajar. She was alone. Her mind screamed at her to run. The front door was right there. She could take the elevator, flee into the night, and never look back. It was her one chance to escape this nightmare. She stood up, her legs trembling, and took a step toward the door.
But she stopped.
She thought of the boy in the photo.
Jaewa.
He was still in there, buried beneath the ice and steel of Quan Jin Huan. He had stolen her wallet not for money, but to find a ghost. To confirm a hope he must have carried for 15 years. And now his world was threatening to swallow her whole, but it was also threatening him. Leaving him now felt like a second abandonment. She made a deliberate choice. She walked to the heavy front door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. With a decisive click, she slid the deadbolt into place. She didn't run. She stayed. When Jean emerged from the other room minutes later, his face was a grim mask. He stopped short when he saw her standing by the door, his eyes dropping to the locked deadbolt. He looked back at her, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He didn't ask why she'd done it. He didn't have to. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. For the first time, he said her name, and it sounded different from how anyone else had ever said it. It wasn't the casual call of a customer or the tired sigh of her landlord. He said it like a word he had been holding on the tip of his tongue for a decade and a half, a forgotten prayer suddenly remembered. Zara. The choice were relentless. Jin's organization called them jackals, scavengers who grew bold when they smelled blood. And Jean, by bringing a civilian into his penthouse, had shown them a wound. They didn't know who Zara was, not yet. They only knew she was new, unprotected, a soft target. We have to move you, Jean announced 2 days later. He had been a ghost in his own home, consumed by hush phone calls and meetings with men whose faces were carved from stone. Zara had been confined to the penthouse, a gilded cage where the only entertainment was watching the city breathe below. Move me where? She asked, folding her arms across her chest. The orange diner dress had been replaced by simple, comfortable clothes one of his men had delivered, a black sweater and jeans that fit surprisingly well. A safe house. Here, you're a symbol. There, you will be a secret. The transfer was meant to be discreet. A nondescript sedan in the middle of the afternoon rush hour.
No motorcad, no habeas guards.
Just Jean, Zara, and a driver. It was a calculated risk, an attempt to slip through the city's arteries unnoticed. The jackals were waiting. They were 3 blocks from the penthouse when a black SUV slammed into their side, the shriek of metal on metal, a deafening scream. The world became a violent, spinning chaos of shattered glass and jolting impacts. Zara was thrown against the door, her head cracking against the window. Before she could even register the pain, Jin's body was covering hers. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his weight a solid, living shield, tucking her head down as the car screeched to a halt. Stay down, he roared, the command cutting through the ringing in her ears. The sharp crack of gunfire erupted around them. Bullets pinged against the car's armored body. Jean drew a sleek, black handgun from inside his jacket, his movements fluid and terrifyingly calm. He returned fire through the shattered back window, each shot a deliberate, measured punctuation mark in the symphony of violence. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal filled the car. It was suffocating. Zara could feel the tension in Jin's muscles, the heat of his body pressed against hers. In the middle of a firefight, surrounded by death, she had never felt more protected. He was a creature of this element, moving through violence like it was a language he was born speaking. It was over in less than a minute. The return fire stopped. Jean slowly lifted himself off her, his eyes scanning the street, his gun still raised. "They're gone," he said, his voice tight. Their driver was slumped over the wheel, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. The SUV that hit them was already peeling away, disappearing into traffic. It was only then that Zara saw the blood. A dark red slash on the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder. "You're hit," she breathed. "It's a graze," he dismissed, his focus already on their next move. He opened his door, pulling her out with him. "We go on foot."
Now.
He led them through a labyrinth of back alleys, his pace fast and urgent. The adrenaline coursing through Zara's veins kept her moving, her earlier head injury a dull throb. They emerged into a different neighborhood, one of brick warehouses and quiet streets. He led her to an unmarked steel door and punched a code into a keypad. The safe house was the opposite of the penthouse. It was Spartan functional. A small kitchen, a bed, a table. It was a concrete box designed for survival, not comfort. "Sit," he ordered, his voice strained. He finally looked down at his arm as if just remembering it was injured. "Let me see," she insisted, her voice firmer than she expected. He hesitated, then nodded, shrugging off his ruined jacket and unbuttoning his shirt. The cut was deeper than a graze, a nasty gash oozing blood. The safe house had a well-stocked first aid kit. She found antiseptic, gauze, and bandages. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she began to clean the wound. She'd seen worse at the diner, kitchen accidents, drunken brawls. This was just different. This was a wound earned in a war she was now a part of. As she worked, his phone rang again. It was one of his lieutenants, his voice tinny and panicked over the speaker. "Sir, what is your location?" "We're sweeping the area." Jean started to reply, but Zara put a finger to her lips, shaking her head urgently. A thought, cold and clear, cut through her fear. The choice had known their route. They had been waiting. What if there was a leak? What if giving their location, even to his own men, was a mistake? She took the phone from his unresisting hand. "He's fine," she said, her voice a calm, authoritative lie. "The situation is contained. Maintain your current positions. We will contact you." She ended the call before the man could protest. It was a small thing, a lie told to protect him, but it was a line crossed. She had made a tactical decision in his world. She had chosen his side, not just by staying but by acting. Jean stared at her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't tried to stop her. He had let her take control. She finished bandaging his arm, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of his bicep. The space between them was charged, the air thick with the smell of blood and antiseptic and the faint, lingering scent of his cologne, cedarwood and smoke. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He caught her hand, his fingers closing gently around her wrist, stopping her movement. His gaze was intense, burning through her defenses. "I spent 15 years building an empire so no one could ever take anything from me again," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Then you walk into a diner, and I realize I left the most important thing behind." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more dangerous. A confession of a fatal error. An admission that she was the one piece of his past he could not control, the one person who could unravel the cold, perfect world he had built. The next move came 2 days later. The choice, having failed to grab them in the ambush, went for the next best thing. They went for her past. When one of Jin's men did a quiet check on her old apartment, he found the message. A dead crow on her doorstep, a single white lily tucked under its wing. It was a direct threat. "We know who she is. We know where she came from. She is not safe anywhere." The war was no longer just his. It had become hers. The choice had made it personal. They were trying to get to him by terrorizing her, and in doing so, they had made a grave mistake. They had woken something up in Zara. Not fear, but a cold, hard resolve. They had targeted her life, her history. They would not get away with it. "They think you're my weakness," Jean said, his voice like ice. They were looking at a satellite map of her old apartment building, projected onto the wall of the safe house. "They'll use it as bait. They'll expect me to come for them there, a direct assault to reclaim my honor." He was right. It was a classic trap, designed to appeal to a man's pride. A frontal assault was exactly what the choice would anticipate. Jean was already outlining a plan with his lieutenants over a secure line, a plan involving overwhelming force. But Zara saw something else. She saw the trap from the perspective of the bait. "They're wrong," she said quietly, stepping up to the map. Jean and his men on the call fell silent. "They don't expect you to be smart. They expect you to be angry. They'll have all their men watching the front, the roof, the alley. But they won't be watching here." She pointed to a small, unassuming dry cleaner shop on the ground floor of the adjacent building. "I used to work there for a few months. The basement connects to the service tunnels for both buildings. It's old, filled with pipes and rats. No one uses it." Her knowledge of the ordinary world, her world, was now a weapon in his. "They're watching for an army. They won't be looking for a ghost." Jean looked at her, a new light in his eyes.
It was respect.
He had surrounded himself with soldiers, but she had given him something they couldn't, an angle born of a life he had never lived.
He changed the plan.
The climax was not a firefight. It was a surgical strike. Jean and two of his most trusted men went in through the tunnels, just as Zara had said. She insisted on going, not to fight, but to guide them through the maze she remembered. She was the key. They emerged in the basement of her old building, the air thick with the smell of dust and damp concrete. They moved up the service stairs, silent as shadows. The Choi family's men were all positioned as she'd predicted, their attention focused outward, waiting for a war that would never come. Jin's team moved with brutal, silent efficiency, neutralizing the guards one by one. But in the chaos, one of the Choi soldiers, hearing a faint noise, doubled back. He came around a corner just as Jean was taking down another man, his back exposed for a split second. The soldier raised his weapon. There was no time to shout a warning. Zara didn't hesitate. She acted. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy, metal fire extinguisher from the wall, and swung it with all her strength into the back of the man's knees. He buckled with a grunt of pain, his shot going wide, shattering a plaster wall. The momentary distraction was all Jean needed. He spun, disarming the man with a fluid, lethal motion. She had saved him. In the ringing silence that followed, the threat was over. The Choi family's ambush had been dismantled from the inside out. Jean stood over the last unconscious guard, his chest heaving slightly. He turned to look at Zara, who stood with the fire extinguisher still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked over to her, his eyes searching her face. He reached out, not to take the extinguisher, but to gently touch a faint scar above his own eyebrow, a pale line against his skin. "The family who took me gave me this," he said, his voice low and raw. "They taught me that loyalty is a weapon, that love is a liability. You remind me that loyalty used to just be a promise between two kids against the world." He was no longer seeing her as a weakness to be protected. He was seeing her as an equal, the missing piece of himself that made him whole, not by completing him, but by reminding him of who he was before the world had tried to break him. The cost of that victory was absolute. Her old life was incinerated. The diner, the apartment, the quiet, desperate dream of a normal future, all of it was ash. There was no going back. To choose him was to choose this life of shadows and violence, forever. They stood in the penthouse once more. The rain had stopped. The city was a quiet, glittering spectacle below. Jean stood by the window, looking down at the empire he commanded. Zara came to stand beside him, their reflections captured in the dark glass. A girl whose simple dress had been replaced by the quiet confidence of a survivor, and a man who ruled an underworld, forever bound by a faded photograph. "You can still leave," he said, his voice soft, not looking at her. "I would give you enough money to disappear. Start over anywhere you want. A new name. A clean slate." It was the ultimate test. The freedom she had once craved, offered to her on a silver platter. She could walk away, leave the ghosts and the gunfire behind. She looked at their reflections in the glass. Two orphans who had found each other again in the most violent of circumstances. She had spent her whole life feeling adrift, alone. Here, in the heart of the storm, she had found an anchor. She had found the other half of her story. "No," she said, her voice steady and clear, a quiet certainty in the vast, empty room. "I think I'm finally home." He finally turned to face her, and the cold, guarded stillness in his eyes was gone. In its place was something she had only seen once before, in the faded photo of a fierce little boy. It was possession. It was certainty. It was the unmistakable look of a king who had just reclaimed his entire world.